Evelyn Whitmore's hands trembled as she stood at the top of the marble staircase, staring down at a sight that made her stomach twist into a hard knot. Below her, in the golden light of 1,000 candles, her husband walked into the grandest ball of the season, with another woman on his arm. She blinked, certain her eyes were playing tricks on her. But the woman was real. Tall, poised, dressed in a deep red gown that caught every eye in the hall. She walked beside Duke Ashford Whitmore, as though she belonged there. As though she had every right to be seen with him in front of everyone who mattered. Evelyn's fingers curled around the banister. For a moment, she could not move. She could not breathe. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all of it faded into a dull hum as she watched her husband guide the stranger through the crowd, nodding politely to guests, smiling, in that easy way he never smiled at her anymore. She had spent weeks preparing for this night. She had imagined arriving together, his hand resting on the small of her back, the two of them greeted as a couple who still meant something to each other. Instead, she stood alone at the top of the stairs, while he walked below with someone else, and no one seemed to notice, or perhaps no one dared to say anything. A young footman offered her a glass of champagne. She took it without looking at him, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding below. She needed a moment to steady herself before she descended into a room full of people who would surely be watching her reaction. She could already imagine the whispers beginning, the fans lifted to hide smirking mouths, the sideways glances that would follow her for the rest of the evening. Evelyn had married Duke 3 years ago, in a ceremony that had been the talk of the county for months. Back then, he had looked at her as though she were the only person in the room. He had written her letters filled with warmth, had danced with her until her feet ached, had promised her a life built on partnership and respect. Somewhere along the way, that man had slipped away from her, replaced by someone distant and cold, someone who spent more time at his desk or away on business than he did beside her. She had told herself it was simply the pressure of managing the estate, the demands of his position, the weight of expectations placed on a man of his standing. She had made excuses for him more times than she could count, but standing here now, watching him walk into the ball with another woman, she understood that no excuse could explain this. She forced herself to breathe, set the champagne glass down on a passing tray, and began her descent. Every step felt heavier than the last. She held her chin high, the way her mother had taught her, the way a woman of her position was expected to carry herself no matter what storm raged inside her. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, several heads had already turned in her direction. She caught snippets of conversation, hushed and quick, cut off the moment she drew near. She kept her expression calm, though her heart pounded so hard she feared everyone could hear it. Across the room, Duke had not yet noticed her arrival. He was speaking with a group of gentlemen, the woman in red standing close beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, in a way that made Evelyn's throat tighten. She recognized the woman now, Lady Seraphina Vale. A name she had heard mentioned in passing over the years, always with a hint of scandal attached to it, always spoken of as someone Duke had known long before their marriage. Evelyn had never given the name much thought. She had assumed it belonged to the past, to a chapter of her husband's life that had closed long before she ever met him. Seeing Seraphina here tonight, dressed as though she were the guest of honor, told her a different story. She made her way through the crowd, greeting acquaintances with practiced smiles, accepting compliments on her gown with polite nods, all while her mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing. Perhaps there was an explanation. Perhaps Seraphina had arrived separately and simply happened to enter at the same moment as Duke. Perhaps this was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence that would resolve itself the moment she reached her husband's side. But as she drew closer, she saw the way Duke leaned toward Seraphina when he spoke, the way his laughter came easily, the way his eyes held hers a moment too long. It was not the behavior of a man greeting an old acquaintance. It was the behavior of a man comfortable in the company of someone he cared for deeply. Evelyn stopped a few feet away, waiting for him to notice her. When he finally did, his expression shifted only slightly. A flicker of surprise quickly smoothed over into something unreadable. "Evelyn," he said, his voice even, as though nothing unusual were happening at all. "I did not see you arrive." "Clearly," she replied, keeping her tone light despite the storm building inside her. "You seemed rather occupied." Seraphina turned to face her then, offering a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Lady Whitmore, what a pleasure." Ashford has told me so much about you." Evelyn studied the woman for a moment, taking in the confidence in her posture, the familiarity in the way she used Duke's first name in front of his own wife. "Has he?" Evelyn said simply, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a longer response. An awkward silence stretched between the three of them, broken only by the distant sound of the orchestra tuning their instruments for the next dance. Duke cleared his throat, glancing around as though searching for an escape from the moment he had created. "Serafina is an old friend," he said finally. "Her family has recently returned from abroad. I thought it only proper to welcome her back into society." Evelyn wanted to ask why that welcome required him to walk through the front doors with her arm in his, in front of every important family in the county, without so much as a word to his own wife beforehand. She wanted to ask why he had not mentioned this old friend once in 3 years of marriage, but she knew better than to voice those questions here, surrounded by watching eyes and listening ears. "How thoughtful of you," she said instead, her voice steady despite everything. "I hope you enjoy the evening, Lady Vale." She turned away before either of them could respond, moving through the crowd with as much grace as she could manage. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to find a quiet corner where she could gather herself away from prying eyes. But she knew that leaving now would only fuel the whispers already spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. She found a spot near one of the tall windows, accepting a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray, and taking a slow sip to calm her nerves. From here, she could see much of the ballroom, including the spot where Duke and Serafina still stood, now joined by several other guests, eager to greet the newly returned lady. Evelyn watched them for a long moment, trying to understand what she had missed, what signs she had failed to notice over the past months. Had there been letters she never saw? Meetings she never knew about? She thought back to the many evenings Duke had claimed business kept him away, the trips to the city that grew more frequent as the months passed. Had Serafina been the reason all along? She pushed the thought away, unwilling to let her mind spiral into assumptions she could not prove. There would be time later for questions, for confrontations, for whatever conversation needed to happen between herself and her husband. Tonight, she needed to survive the ball with her dignity intact. A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You look as though you could use better company." She turned to find Lord Julian Ashcombe standing beside her, his expression warm, despite the tension she knew existed between him and Duke. The two men had never been friends, their rivalry stretching back years, long before Evelyn had entered either of their lives. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Julian had once courted her, back when she was younger, before Duke had swept in and claimed her attention with his charm and his title. She had not spoken with Julian in any meaningful way since her wedding day. Seeing him now, offering her a kind smile in the middle of what felt like the worst evening of her life, brought an unexpected wave of relief. "Lord Ashcombe," she said, managing a small smile of her own. "I did not expect to see you here." "I could say the same," he replied, his gaze flickering briefly toward the spot where Duke stood with Serafina, before returning to Evelyn. "Though it seems the evening has already provided enough surprises for everyone." She felt her cheeks warm, embarrassed that he had witnessed the scene, that everyone had witnessed it. "It is not what it appears," she said quickly, then immediately regretted the words. She owed him no explanation, and defending Duke's behavior felt wrong, even to her own ears. Julian studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You do not need to explain anything to me, Lady Whitmore. I only wish to see that you are not standing alone in a room full of people who care more for gossip than for kindness." His words touched something in her that she had not expected. For the first time all evening, she felt as though someone actually saw her, truly saw the hurt she was trying so hard to hide beneath her composed exterior. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." The orchestra began to play, signaling the start of the next dance. Couples began moving toward the center of the floor, forming lines and pairs in preparation. Evelyn glanced toward Duke, who remained deep in conversation with Serafina, seemingly unbothered by the fact that his own wife stood across the room without a partner. Julian followed her gaze, then extended his hand toward her, his expression gentle but sincere. "Would you do me the honor of this dance, Lady Whitmore? Only if you wish it, of course. I would not want to add to whatever difficulties this evening has already brought you." Evelyn looked at his outstretched hand, then glanced once more toward her husband, who had not so much as looked in her direction since their brief exchange. Something inside her, some quiet spark of defiance and hurt and longing to feel valued again, urged her to accept. She placed her hand in his. "I would like that very much," she said. As they walked toward the dance floor together, Evelyn could feel the weight of eyes turning toward them, could sense the whispers beginning anew, different this time, sharper, more curious. She knew this moment would be remembered, discussed, perhaps even exaggerated in the retelling over the following weeks. But for the first time that evening, she did not care. The music swelled, and Julian led her into the first steps of the dance, his hand steady at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers. For a few precious minutes, the humiliation of the evening faded into the background, replaced by something she had not felt in longer than she cared to admit. She felt seen. She felt valued. She felt, for just a moment, like herself again. Across the room, though she did not notice it at first, Duke had finally turned his attention away from Serafina. His eyes found his wife on the dance floor, moving gracefully in the arms of the one man he had spent years trying to outdo in every way that mattered to him. His jaw tightened, his hands curled slightly at his sides. Whatever comfort he had found in Serafina's company moments ago evaporated entirely, replaced by a feeling he refused to name, though it burned through him all the same. The night was far from over, and neither Evelyn nor Duke yet understood how much everything was about to change. The dance carried on for what felt like both a heartbeat and an eternity. Evelyn moved through the steps with Julian, her feet remembering rhythms she had not practiced in years, her mind slowly beginning to quiet as the music wrapped around her like a shield against the room full of watching eyes. For a while, she almost forgot where she was and why her heart had been aching only minutes before. Julian was an easy partner, his movements confident but never showy, his conversation light enough to ease her nerves without demanding anything from her that she was not ready to give. He asked about her garden, about the roses she had once mentioned to him years ago at a dinner neither of them had expected the other to attend. She found herself answering honestly, even smiling once or twice, surprised at how natural it felt to speak with someone who seemed genuinely interested in her answers rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. But even as she lost herself in the dance, she remained aware of Duke's presence across the room. She could feel him watching, though she did not turn to confirm it. She could sense the shift in the air, the way certain guests near him had gone quiet, glancing between the dance floor and wherever Duke now stood. When the music finally slowed to its close, Julian bowed to her with the same gentle formality he had shown from the start. "Thank you for the dance, Lady Whitmore. It was a pleasure I did not expect tonight, though I am grateful for it all the same." "The pleasure was mine," Evelyn replied, and she meant it, though a small part of her already braced for what might come next. She did not have to wait long. Duke appeared at the edge of the dance floor before she had even stepped away from Julian, his expression carefully composed for the benefit of onlookers, though Evelyn could see the tightness around his eyes that betrayed his true feelings. Serafina was nowhere in sight, likely swept off into conversation with some other guest, leaving Duke free to close the distance between himself and his wife. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, "a word, if you please." She glanced at Julian, who gave her a small nod, silently letting her know he would step away if she wished it, but would remain close if she needed him. She appreciated the gesture more than she could say. "Of course," Evelyn said to Duke, keeping her tone even, "though I hope whatever you wish to discuss can wait until we are somewhere more private. I would rather not give our guests further entertainment for the evening." Something flickered across Duke's face, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps irritation at being reminded of the scene he himself had created. "The garden terrace," he said. "Now, if you would." Evelyn excused herself from Julian with a quiet word of thanks, then followed Duke through the crowd, past clusters of guests who tried and failed to appear as though they were not watching the pair of them with keen interest. She kept her chin high, refusing to let her posture betray the storm building within her. Whatever conversation awaited her on that terrace, she intended to face it with the same composure she had carried since the moment she descended the staircase. The terrace doors opened onto a wide stone balcony overlooking the gardens below, lit softly by lanterns strung along the railing. The cool night air was a welcome relief after the heat and noise of the ballroom, and for a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to breathe deeply, gathering her thoughts before Duke could speak. He did not wait long. The moment the doors closed behind them, muffling the music and chatter from within, his composure cracked. "What was that display on the dance floor?" he demanded, his voice sharp despite his effort to keep it low. "Dancing with Ashcombe, of all people. Did you not consider how that would appear to everyone in that room?" Evelyn turned to face him fully, disbelief washing over her at the audacity of his question. "How it would appear? You walked into this ball with another woman on your arm, Duke. You are asking me how a single dance appears?" "That is different," he said quickly, though even he seemed to hear how weak the words sounded once spoken aloud. "Is it?" Evelyn's voice remained steady, though it carried an edge she rarely allowed herself to use. "Explain to me how it is different. Explain to me why you thought it acceptable to bring Lady Vale here tonight, without a single word to me beforehand, while I am expected to simply smile and accept it." Duke ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized from the early days of their marriage, back when frustration had still felt like something they could work through together, rather than something that drove them further apart. "Serafina is an old friend. Her family only recently returned to England. I thought it would be seen as a kindness to help ease her back into society." "A kindness," Evelyn repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "You have never once mentioned her name to me in 3 years of marriage, and now she appears at your side, as though she belongs there, and I am meant to believe this is nothing more than simple kindness." Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Evelyn thought he might finally offer her the truth, whatever it was he had been holding back. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and adopted the cool, distant tone she had grown far too familiar with over the past year. "You are reading far too much into a simple gesture of goodwill," he said. "I would ask that you not embarrass either of us further by dancing with Ashcombe again this evening. You know how matters stand between us." Evelyn let out a short, humorless laugh, the sound surprising even herself. "How matters stand between you and Lord Ashcombe is your concern, not mine. I danced with a kind gentleman because my own husband abandoned me the moment we arrived. If that embarrasses you, perhaps you should consider what caused it in the first place." "Evelyn." "No," she said, cutting him off with a firmness that startled them both. "I have spent 3 years making excuses for your absences, your coldness, your endless business that always seemed to take you away, just when I needed you most. I told myself, it was the pressure of your position, the demands placed upon you. But tonight, watching you walk in with her, I finally understand that none of those excuses were ever true. You simply did not want to be here, with me." Duke's expression shifted, something almost like guilt flashing across his features, before he masked it once more with careful control. "That is not fair." "Is it not?" Evelyn stepped closer, refusing to let him retreat behind his usual detachment. "Then tell me, Duke. Tell me the truth about Serafina Vale. Tell me why her name has never once crossed your lips in all our years together, and why tonight, of all nights, you thought it wise to bring her here on your arm." For a long moment, Duke said nothing. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant strains of music drifting from the ballroom and the soft rustle of wind through the garden hedges below. Evelyn watched his face carefully, searching for any sign of the man she had once believed she married, the man who had written her letters filled with warmth and promise. She found none. "There is nothing to tell," Duke finally said, though his voice lacked the conviction needed to make the words believable. "Serafina is a friend from my past, nothing more." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. "You are lying to me. I do not know why, and perhaps I do not wish to know the full truth tonight. But I know a lie when I hear one. Duke, I have heard enough of them from you over the past year to recognize the sound." Before Duke could respond, the terrace door opened once more, and Julian stepped through, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes carried a sharpness that had not been there during their dance. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his gaze flickering between Evelyn and Duke, taking in the tension that hung heavy in the air between them. "Lady Whitmore, your carriage has been readied, should you wish to leave early. I thought you would want to know." Evelyn had not requested any such thing, and she understood immediately that Julian had invented the excuse simply to give her a way out of the conversation, a graceful exit from a confrontation that showed no signs of resolving itself peacefully. Duke's eyes narrowed as he looked between the two of them. "This does not concern you, Ashcombe." "On the contrary," Julian replied, his tone remaining calm despite the challenge in Duke's voice. "Lady Whitmore's comfort concerns me a great deal. particularly when I see her cornered on a terrace by a man who seems more interested in defending his own behavior than considering hers." Duke took a step forward, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You would do well to remember your place. And you would do well to remember that a lady deserves better treatment than what you have shown your wife this evening." Julian shot back, his voice hardening for the first time since the exchange began. Evelyn stepped between them before the tension could escalate further, placing a hand lightly on Julian's arm, a silent request for him to stand down. "Please," she said quietly, "both of you. This is not the place, nor the time." Duke's gaze lingered on the small gesture, on Evelyn's hand resting against Julian's sleeve, and something dark passed across his features before he forced it away, replacing it with the cool mask he wore so often these days. "Fine," he said stiffly. "We will discuss this further at home." "Perhaps," Evelyn said, though she made no promises. "Or perhaps we have already said everything that needs saying tonight." She turned away from him then, walking toward the terrace doors with Julian falling into step slightly behind her, close enough to offer support without overstepping the boundaries of what remained appropriate between them. Behind her, she heard Duke's sharp exhale, followed by silence, though she did not look back to see his expression. Inside the ballroom, the music had shifted to a slower piece, and guests moved about in smaller groups, engaged in quiet conversations that Evelyn suspected centered almost entirely on the scene that had just unfolded outside. She kept her composure as she crossed the room, offering polite nods to those who caught her eye, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the evening had shaken her. She found a quiet corner near the refreshment table, accepting a glass of water from a passing footman with a grateful nod. Julian remained nearby, though he gave her space, understanding, without needing to be told that she required a moment to gather herself. "Thank you," she said softly, once she trusted her voice not to waver. "For earlier, the excuse about the carriage." Julian offered a small smile. "I could not stand by and watch him speak to you that way, regardless of what history exists between us. No one deserves to be cornered and made to feel small on a night that should have been enjoyable." Evelyn studied him for a moment, appreciating the sincerity behind his words. "You have always been kind to me, even when you had little reason to be." "I have my reasons," Julian said quietly, though he did not elaborate further, and Evelyn found she was not yet ready to ask him to explain. Across the room, she caught sight of Serafina once more, standing near a group of gentlemen, her laughter carrying faintly over the music. Duke had not yet returned from the terrace, and Evelyn wondered how long he intended to remain out there alone, nursing whatever wounded pride the confrontation had left behind. She thought of the years she had spent trying to understand him, trying to bridge the growing distance between them with patience and understanding, believing that whatever troubled him would eventually pass, that the man she had married still existed somewhere beneath the coldness he had adopted. Standing here now, in the aftermath of his public betrayal, she began to wonder if that man had ever truly existed at all, or if she had simply imagined him into being because it was easier than facing the truth. The evening stretched on, filled with polite conversation and forced smiles, though Evelyn felt increasingly detached from it all, as though she were watching herself move through the motions from somewhere outside her own body. She danced twice more, once with an elderly gentleman who spoke at length about his grandchildren, and once with a young man newly arrived from the north, who seemed blissfully unaware of the scandal unfolding around him. Duke eventually returned from the terrace, his expression once again schooled into careful neutrality, though Evelyn noticed he kept a careful distance from her for the remainder of the evening, choosing instead to remain near Serafina and the small circle of guests who had gathered around her. Evelyn told herself she did not care, that his choice to avoid her only confirmed what she already suspected, that whatever remained of their marriage had grown too fragile to survive the weight of tonight's revelations. But beneath the composed exterior she maintained for the sake of appearances, something inside her ached with a grief she had not expected to feel so sharply. As the evening finally began to wind down, and guests started making their way toward the entrance hall to call for their carriages, Evelyn found herself standing near the grand staircase once more, watching the scene below with a strange sense of detachment. Duke had already gone ahead, escorting Serafina to her carriage with a courtesy he had not shown his own wife all evening. Julian appeared beside her once more, his presence steady and reassuring. "May I escort you to your carriage, Lady Whitmore?" Evelyn considered the offer for a moment, aware of how it might look to the remaining guests, aware of the whispers that would surely follow her home tonight and continue long after. But she found she no longer had the strength to care what others thought, not after everything the evening had already cost her. "I would appreciate that very much," she said. As they descended the staircase together, Evelyn glanced one final time toward the entrance, where Duke stood beside Serafina's carriage, saying something that made the other woman laugh softly before he stepped back to let the vehicle depart. He did not look toward the staircase, did not seem to notice or care that his wife was leaving with another man at her side. Evelyn turned away, allowing Julian to guide her through the remaining crowd and out into the cool night air, where her own carriage waited to carry her home, to a house that no longer felt like it belonged to her. The ball had ended, but Evelyn understood, as she settled into the carriage and watched the lights of the grand estate fade into the distance behind her, that whatever had happened tonight was only the beginning. The careful world she and Duke had built together, however fragile and imperfect it had been, had cracked wide open in front of everyone who mattered, and there would be no simply putting the pieces back together as though nothing had changed. Something had shifted tonight, not just in the eyes of society, but within herself. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn felt the stirrings of something she had thought long buried beneath years of quiet disappointment and patient understanding. She felt the beginning of resolve. Evelyn did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her chamber, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, replaying the events of the ball over and over in her mind, until the details blurred together into a single ache that settled deep in her chest. She heard Duke return sometime near dawn, his footsteps heavy on the staircase, pausing outside her door for a long moment, before continuing on toward his own chamber without knocking. She rose before the sun had fully climbed above the hills, dressing quickly, and making her way down to the small breakfast room, where she usually took her morning tea alone. The house felt different this morning, quieter than usual, as though even the walls understood that something had shifted the night before. Her lady's maid, a gentle woman named Charlotte who had served Evelyn since her wedding day, entered with a tray of tea and toast, her expression carefully neutral, though Evelyn could see the concern hiding just beneath the surface. "Good morning, my lady," Charlotte said softly, setting the tray down on the table. "I trust you slept well." Evelyn managed a small, tired smile. "You need not pretend with me, Charlotte. I know word of last night has already reached the servants' quarters." Charlotte hesitated, then nodded, abandoning the pretense. "The whole house is talking of it, my lady, though none dare say a word within his grace's hearing. I am sorry. You did not deserve such treatment, not after everything you have given this family." The kindness in Charlotte's voice nearly broke through the composure Evelyn had worked so hard to maintain. She pressed her lips together, blinking back the sudden sting of tears, and took a slow sip of tea to steady herself. "Thank you, Charlotte. Your loyalty means more to me than you know." Charlotte lingered a moment longer, as though wanting to say more, before finally excusing herself to attend to other duties, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts and her cooling tea. She had barely finished her breakfast when the door to the breakfast room opened, and Duke entered, already dressed for the day, his expression tight with the particular kind of exhaustion that came not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many unspoken burdens. "Evelyn," he said, taking a seat across from her without waiting for an invitation, "we need to speak about last night." "I agree," she said evenly, setting down her cup, "though I suspect we may have very different ideas about what needs discussing." Duke rubbed a hand across his face, and for a moment, Evelyn caught a glimpse of genuine weariness beneath his usual guarded expression. "I owe you an explanation. About Serafina." Evelyn's heart quickened, though she kept her outward composure steady. "I am listening." He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully, or perhaps simply gathering the courage to speak them aloud at all. "Before I met you, I was engaged to Serafina. Our families had arranged it when we were both quite young, long before either of us had any say in the matter." Evelyn absorbed this information slowly, pieces of the previous night's confusion beginning to click into place. "You were engaged to her, and in 3 years of marriage, you never once thought to mention this?" "It ended badly," Duke continued, ignoring her question for the moment. "Her family fell into significant debt, and mine could no longer justify the match once the scandal became public. My father broke the engagement, and Serafina's family left England shortly after, humiliated by the whole affair. I had not seen or heard from her in nearly 6 years, not until she wrote to me a few months ago, informing me that she and her family had finally returned. And you decided the appropriate response was to bring her to the most public event of the season, without so much as a word of warning to your own wife, Evelyn said, her voice sharpening despite her effort to remain calm. Duke's jaw tightened. I know how it appeared. I handled it poorly. But you must understand, Evelyn, there was nothing improper in my intentions. I merely wished to help an old friend re-enter society, without the burden of her family's past following her into every room. An old friend, Evelyn repeated, echoing the same phrase he had used the night before. Duke, you were engaged to marry her. That is not the language one uses to describe a simple friend. He fell silent, unable to argue against the truth of her observation, and Evelyn found herself studying his face carefully, searching for the sincerity she desperately wanted to find there, though she was no longer certain she could trust her own judgment where he was concerned. Do you still hold feelings for her? Evelyn asked finally, the question she had been avoiding since the moment she saw Serafina on his arm the night before. Duke's hesitation, however brief, told her more than any answer could have. I do not know, he admitted quietly. I have not allowed myself to consider such things since our own marriage began, but seeing her again after all these years, I confess it stirred memories I had thought long settled. The honesty, though painful, was somehow easier to bear than another lie would have been. Evelyn nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his admission. Thank you for telling me the truth at least, though I cannot say it brings me any comfort. Evelyn, I never intended to hurt you. Intentions matter little when the outcome causes harm regardless, she replied. You brought a woman you once loved, a woman you may still hold feelings for, to a ball in front of everyone who matters in our society, without any regard for how it might affect me or our marriage. Whatever your intentions, the result remains the same. Duke had no response to offer, and the silence between them stretched long and heavy, filled with everything neither of them seemed willing to say aloud. Finally, he rose from his seat, straightening his jacket with a motion that seemed more habit than purpose. I have business in the city that cannot wait, he said. I will return within the week. Perhaps some distance will allow us both to think more clearly about how to proceed. Evelyn watched him leave the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway before fading into silence, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether his business trips over the past year had truly been about business at all, or whether they had simply been convenient excuses to escape a marriage that had grown too complicated for him to face. She spent the remainder of the morning in the small sitting room that overlooked the eastern gardens, a space she had always found comforting, though today even the familiar view of blooming roses failed to ease the turmoil churning within her. She thought of Julian, of the kindness he had shown her the night before, the way he had stepped in without hesitation to shield her from further humiliation. She thought of the years she had spent building a life with a man who, she now realized, had never fully given himself to their marriage, always holding some part of himself back, reserved perhaps for a woman he had never truly stopped loving. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Charlotte entered once more, this time carrying a small folded letter on a silver tray. This arrived for you, my lady. The messenger said it was urgent. Evelyn accepted the letter, recognizing the elegant, familiar handwriting immediately as belonging to her closest friend, Lady Margaret Sinclair, who had married into a neighboring estate several years prior and remained one of the few people Evelyn trusted completely with her private thoughts. She broke the seal and unfolded the paper, reading quickly. My dearest Evelyn, I have heard the most troubling accounts of last night's events, and I write immediately to ensure you are well. Please, if you have any need of company, or simply a listening ear, come to me at once. I have already instructed my carriage to be made ready should you wish to visit. You need not face this alone, whatever has happened. Your devoted friend, Margaret. Evelyn felt a wave of gratitude wash over her at the words, grateful for a friend who cared enough to reach out so quickly. She penned a brief reply, accepting the invitation, and within the hour found herself in her own carriage, making the short journey to Margaret's estate on the other side of the county. Margaret received her with open arms the moment she stepped through the door, pulling Evelyn into a warm embrace, before leading her toward a private sitting room, where they could speak without fear of servants overhearing. Tell me everything, Margaret said once they were settled, tea poured, and the door firmly closed behind them. I have heard 3 different versions of the story already, each more scandalous than the last, and I would much rather hear the truth from you than continue guessing which parts hold any merit." Evelyn recounted the events of the previous evening, from the moment she saw Duke walk into the ball with Serafina, to the confrontation on the terrace, and finally the conversation from that very morning, revealing the truth of Duke's past engagement. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression shifting between sympathy and outrage as the story unfolded. "The audacity," Margaret said once Evelyn had finished, shaking her head slowly. "To bring his former fiancée to a public ball without a word of warning, and then to admit he may still harbor feelings for her. Evelyn, I hardly know what to say." "There is little to say that I have not already thought myself," Evelyn admitted, staring into her teacup. "I have spent 3 years trying to understand him, trying to be patient with his distance, believing there was some reasonable explanation for the growing coldness between us. I no longer believe that to be true." Margaret reached over and took Evelyn's hand, squeezing it gently. "And what of Lord Ashcombe? I heard you danced with him last night, and that he came to your defense on the terrace." Evelyn felt a warmth rise in her cheeks despite herself. "He was kind to me, Margaret. Kinder than Duke has been in longer than I care to admit. But I do not know what to make of it, nor do I think it wise to dwell on such thoughts while my marriage remains in such disarray." "Perhaps not," Margaret agreed, though her tone carried a knowing quality that Evelyn chose not to examine too closely. "Though there is no shame in noticing kindness where you find it, especially after being shown so little of it elsewhere." The 2 women talked for hours, Margaret offering both comfort and practical advice, reminding Evelyn that whatever decisions lay ahead, she need not make them in isolation or in haste. By the time Evelyn finally returned home that evening, she felt steadier than she had since the ball began, though the weight of uncertainty regarding her marriage remained heavy on her shoulders. Over the following days, Duke remained in the city as promised, and the house settled into an unusual quiet, broken only by the occasional visit from concerned neighbors or the arrival of letters from acquaintances eager for details of the scandal that had already spread throughout the county with remarkable speed. Evelyn found herself grateful for the distance, using the time to think clearly about what she truly wanted from her marriage and from her life, free from the immediate pressure of Duke's presence. She received a letter from Julian on the 3rd day, brief and carefully worded, inquiring after her well-being and expressing hope that she had found some measure of peace following the events of the ball. She read it several times before penning a short reply, thanking him for his continued kindness and assuring him that she remained well, though she said nothing of the deeper turmoil still churning within her. On the 5th day, word reached her through Charlotte that Serafina had taken up residence at a townhouse not far from where Duke conducted his business in the city, and that the 2 had been seen together on several occasions, walking through public gardens and dining at fashionable establishments frequented by the fashionable set. Evelyn absorbed this information with a strange calm, as though some part of her had already expected it, had already begun preparing herself for the confirmation that whatever remained between Duke and Serafina extended far beyond simple friendship. She spent that evening alone in the estate's small library, surrounded by books she had not touched in months, searching for some measure of distraction from the thoughts that continued to circle relentlessly through her mind. She thought of the wedding vows she had spoken 3 years ago, of the promises she and Duke had made to each other in front of family and friends, promises that seemed to mean so little to him now that an old flame had re-entered his life. She thought too of Julian, of the steady kindness he had shown her, so different from the coldness she had grown accustomed to at home. She did not yet know what to make of the feelings stirring within her whenever she thought of him, feelings she suspected were dangerous to examine too closely while her marriage remained unresolved, but feelings she found increasingly difficult to ignore all the same. By the time Duke finally returned home at the end of the week, Evelyn had reached a quiet resolve of her own. She would not confront him with accusations she could not yet prove, nor would she pretend that nothing had changed between them. Instead, she would watch and wait and gather her own understanding of the truth before deciding what path forward made the most sense for her future. Duke arrived home later than expected, his expression distracted, his manner even more distant than before he had left. He greeted her politely enough over dinner that evening, inquiring after her health and the state of the household affairs in his absence, but Evelyn noticed the way his gaze kept drifting toward the window, as though his thoughts remained elsewhere, perhaps still in the city, perhaps still with the woman he claimed was merely an old friend. She said nothing of the reports she had heard, choosing instead to observe him carefully over the following days, noting the frequency of his letters, the hours he spent locked away in his study, the way he flinched slightly whenever Serafina's name arose in conversation, however innocently. The household, once a place of quiet routine, now felt charged with unspoken tension, every interaction between husband and wife carrying an undercurrent of things left unsaid. Evelyn found herself growing more distant in return, spending increasing amounts of time in her own pursuits, visiting Margaret, corresponding with Julian, and slowly, carefully, beginning to imagine what a life without Duke might actually look like. She did not yet know what the future held, whether her marriage could be salvaged, or whether it had already crumbled beyond repair on the night of the ball. But she understood, with growing clarity, that she would not spend the remainder of her years making excuses for a man who could not offer her the same honesty and devotion she had given so freely for 3 long years. Something had changed within her, quietly but unmistakably, and there would be no returning to the woman she had been before the ball, the woman who accepted disappointment as simply the price of maintaining appearances. Whatever came next, Evelyn intended to face it with open eyes. 2 weeks passed in this strange, careful silence, the household moving through its routines, while an unspoken tension simmered beneath every polite exchange between husband and wife. Evelyn began to notice small things she had previously overlooked, details that now seemed impossible to ignore once she allowed herself to truly pay attention. Duke's study door, once left ajar during the day, now remained firmly locked whenever he stepped away. Letters arrived for him that he tucked quickly into his coat pocket before anyone else could glimpse the handwriting on the envelope. He grew short-tempered with the household staff in ways that were entirely unlike him, snapping at the footman over trivial matters, dismissing his valet early most evenings, as though eager to be left entirely alone with his thoughts. Evelyn said nothing of these observations, choosing instead to gather them quietly, piece by piece, like a woman assembling evidence for a case she had not yet decided whether she wished to pursue. She spent her mornings tending to the household accounts, a task Duke had never shown much interest in overseeing personally, and it was during one such morning, while reviewing the estate's ledgers, that she discovered the first concrete sign that something was truly amiss. A payment, substantial in size, had been withdrawn from the household accounts 3 weeks prior, listed simply as a personal expense, with no further explanation attached. Evelyn stared at the entry for a long moment, her mind racing through possible explanations, none of which brought her any comfort. She knew better than to confront Duke directly, without further information, understanding that he would likely offer some vague justification that would leave her no closer to the truth than before. Instead, she sought out Mr. Collins, the estate's longtime steward, a man who had served the family for over 2 decades, and who Evelyn had always found to be honest and forthcoming, provided one asked the right questions in the right manner. "Mr. Collins," she said, finding him in the small office adjacent to the main hall, where he managed the daily affairs of the estate. "I wonder if you might help me understand an entry in the household ledgers. This withdrawal here, listed simply as a personal do you recall what it was intended for?" Mr. Collins hesitated, and in that brief hesitation, Evelyn understood immediately that he knew more than he was comfortable revealing. "My lady, I believe that particular withdrawal was arranged directly by His Grace. I was not given specific details regarding its purpose, only instructed to process the payment without question." "I see," Evelyn said carefully, keeping her tone light despite the growing unease settling in her chest. "And has this happened often?" "Withdrawals arranged personally by His Grace, without explanation?" Mr. Collins glanced toward the door, as though checking to ensure they remained alone, before answering in a lower voice. "More frequently in recent months, my lady, if I am being entirely honest. I did not think it my place to question His Grace's decisions, though I confess, the pattern has given me some concern." Evelyn thanked him for his honesty, and left the office with far more questions than answers, her mind turning over the implications of what she had learned. If Duke had been quietly funneling money from the household accounts for personal expenses he did not wish to explain, the most obvious conclusion pointed directly toward Serafina, whether in the form of gifts, assistance with her family's lingering debts, or something else entirely that Evelyn did not yet have the full picture to understand. She spent that afternoon in restless contemplation, walking the length of the eastern gardens without truly seeing the roses she passed, her thoughts consumed entirely by the growing certainty that her marriage had become something far more troubling than mere emotional distance. If Duke was indeed providing financial support to Serafina, support that came directly from the estate Evelyn had helped build and maintain over the past 3 years, the betrayal cut deeper than she had initially allowed herself to consider. That evening, she received an unexpected visitor. Lady Prescott, Duke's aunt on his father's side, arrived unannounced shortly before dinner, her expression grim as she was shown into the drawing room where Evelyn sat, attempting, with little success, to focus on a piece of needlework. "Evelyn, my dear," Lady Prescott said, settling into the chair across from her with the particular briskness of a woman who had never once in her life wasted time on unnecessary pleasantries. "I have come because I felt it my duty to speak with you directly, rather than allow you to continue hearing only rumors and half-truths from the gossiping tongues of society." Evelyn set aside her needlework, giving the older woman her full attention. "I appreciate that, Lady Prescott. Please, speak freely." Lady Prescott's expression softened slightly, though the concern in her eyes remained sharp. "I have known Ashford since he was a boy, and I have watched him grow into a man I scarcely recognize these past few months. His association with Lady Vale concerns me greatly, not merely for the scandal it has caused, but for what I know of her family's history, and the manner in which she conducts herself." "What do you know of her exactly?" Evelyn asked, leaning forward slightly, eager for any information that might help her understand the full scope of what she was facing. "Serafina Vale's family fell into ruin years ago, as I am sure Ashford has already told you," Lady Prescott began. "What he may not have told you is that her father's debts were far more extensive than commonly known, and that Serafina herself has developed something of a reputation abroad for attaching herself to wealthy men who prove willing to ease her family's financial burdens. I do not say this to be cruel, merely to ensure you understand the nature of the woman who has re-entered my nephew's life." Evelyn absorbed this information slowly, pieces falling into place alongside what she had already discovered in the household ledgers. "You believe she has returned specifically to seek financial assistance from Duke?" "I believe it entirely possible, yes," Lady Prescott confirmed. "Whether Ashford recognizes this himself, or whether his lingering affection for her has blinded him to her true intentions, I cannot say with certainty. But I have seen this pattern before, my dear, and I would be doing you a disservice if I did not warn you of what I suspect is truly happening." The two women talked for nearly an hour, Lady Prescott sharing what fragments of information she had gathered through her own network of connections, while Evelyn listened carefully, storing away every detail that might prove useful in the days ahead. By the time Lady Prescott finally took her leave, promising to continue keeping a watchful eye on the situation, Evelyn felt both more informed and more unsettled than she had been before the visit began. She did not confront Duke that evening, choosing instead to continue her quiet observation, gathering evidence and understanding, before deciding how best to proceed. But the following morning brought an opportunity she had not anticipated, one that would finally provide the clarity she had been so desperately seeking. Duke had left early for the city once more, citing urgent business that could not wait, and Evelyn found herself alone in the house, with only the servants for company. It was Charlotte who brought her the news, her expression troubled as she entered Evelyn's chamber that afternoon. "My lady, forgive me for intruding, but I felt you should know. One of the stable hands mentioned seeing His Grace's carriage stopped at a townhouse in the city yesterday evening, the same residence where Lady Vale is said to be staying. He remained there for several hours before returning home, well past midnight." Evelyn felt a strange calm settle over her, the kind of stillness that came not from surprise, but from the quiet confirmation of something she had already suspected. "Thank you, Charlotte. I appreciate you telling me. Will you confront him, my lady?" Evelyn considered the question carefully before answering. "Not yet. I wish to understand the full truth before I act, and I fear a hasty confrontation would only allow him to offer more excuses, more half-truths, designed to smooth over what has clearly become something far more serious than a simple friendship." That evening, when Duke returned home, Evelyn watched him carefully over dinner, noting the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume that clung to his coat, the distracted manner in which he picked at his food, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the window, as though his thoughts remained entirely elsewhere. She said nothing of what she had learned, choosing instead to maintain the careful facade of normalcy that had defined their household since his return from the city. But later that night, unable to sleep, she found herself drawn toward his study, the door left carelessly unlocked in his apparent exhaustion. She knew she risked much by entering uninvited, knew that whatever she found might change everything between them beyond any hope of repair. But she also understood that she could no longer continue living in uncertainty, gathering fragments of truth from servants and relatives, while the man she had married continued to offer her nothing but careful evasions. The study was dark, lit only by the moonlight filtering through the tall windows, and Evelyn moved carefully toward the large desk where Duke conducted most of his correspondence. She hesitated only briefly before opening the top drawer, her heart pounding as she searched through the papers within, uncertain exactly what she hoped to find, but knowing she would recognize it the moment she saw it. She found the letters tucked beneath a stack of business correspondence, tied together with a simple ribbon, the handwriting on the outer envelope unmistakably feminine and elegant. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon and began to read, her eyes scanning quickly through words that confirmed every fear she had harbored since the night of the ball. The letters spoke of debts owed, of a family teetering on the edge of ruin, of gratitude for financial assistance already provided, and requests for more to come. But interspersed among the practical matters of money and debt were passages far more personal, expressions of longing for what might have been, gentle reminders of shared memories from years long past. And in the most recent letter, dated only days before, a line that struck Evelyn with particular force. "I know you have obligations now, Ashford, but I cannot help but wonder what our lives might have looked like had circumstances not torn us apart all those years ago. Perhaps it is not too late to discover what remains between us, if only you would allow yourself to consider it." Evelyn set the letter down slowly, her hands steady now despite the storm raging within her. She had her answer, finally, after weeks of uncertainty and careful gathering of fragments. Whatever remained between Duke and Serafina extended far beyond simple friendship, far beyond even the financial assistance Lady Prescott had suspected. This was a man still tethered to feelings he had never fully released, a man willing to deceive his own wife to maintain a connection to a woman from his past. She retied the ribbon carefully, returning the letters to exactly where she had found them, then made her way back to her own chamber in the quiet darkness of the sleeping house. She did not cry, though she suspected the tears would come eventually, once the full weight of what she had discovered settled fully into her understanding. Instead, she sat by her window, staring out at the moonlit gardens below, and began to think, with a clarity she had not possessed before that night, about what she truly wanted from the remainder of her life. She thought of the vows she had spoken, of the years she had invested in a marriage that had clearly meant far less to her husband than it had meant to her. She thought of Julian, of his steady kindness and quiet patience, though she reminded herself firmly that whatever she felt toward him was a matter for another day, separate entirely from the decisions she needed to make regarding her marriage to Duke. And she thought, finally, of herself, of the woman she had been before her marriage, confident and full of her own ambitions and dreams, a woman who had slowly disappeared over 3 years of careful compromise and quiet disappointment. That woman, Evelyn realized as the first hints of dawn began to color the horizon, deserved better than what she had been settling for, and she intended, from this moment forward, to reclaim her. The house remained quiet around her, unaware of the resolve solidifying within its walls, unaware that the careful balance maintained for weeks was about to shift irrevocably toward something neither Duke nor anyone else in their circle had yet anticipated. Evelyn finally understood, with complete certainty, what she needed to do next. Evelyn waited 3 days before confronting Duke with what she had discovered, using the time to steady her resolve and consider exactly how she wished to approach the conversation that would likely determine the fate of her marriage. She did not wish to appear hysterical or accusatory without cause, understanding that Duke had grown skilled at deflecting blame and offering half-truths whenever cornered. This time, she intended to leave him no room for evasion. She chose a quiet evening when the household staff had retired for the night, ensuring privacy for whatever conversation followed. Duke had returned from another day in the city, his manner as distracted as it had been for weeks, and Evelyn found him in his study, reviewing correspondence by candlelight. "Duke," she said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation, "we need to speak." He looked up, his expression shifting to mild surprise at her uncharacteristic directness. "Of course. Is something troubling you?" Evelyn closed the door behind her, then reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew the small bundle of letters she had taken from his desk drawer 3 nights prior. Letters she had since kept hidden among her own belongings, waiting for the right moment to present them. She placed them on the desk before him, watching his face carefully as recognition dawned, followed swiftly by something close to panic. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice tight. "In your desk, where you apparently believed they would remain safely hidden from me," Evelyn replied, her own voice remarkably steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "I have read them, Duke, all of them. I know about the money you have been sending her. I know about the feelings you still harbor, feelings you have never fully released despite 3 years of marriage to me." Duke sat back in his chair, his composure crumbling for the first time since the night of the ball. "Evelyn, I can explain." "Please do," she said, crossing her arms and standing firm despite the urge to retreat from the conversation entirely. "I would very much like to hear how you intend to explain lying to me for months, funneling money from our household accounts to a woman you claim is merely an old friend, while allowing letters filled with talk of what might have been to accumulate in your desk drawer." Duke rubbed his hands over his face, clearly searching for words that might soften the truth he could no longer avoid confessing. "Serafina's family situation is worse than I initially explained. Her father's debts have grown severe enough that they face the possibility of losing everything: their home, their remaining standing in society. I felt an obligation to help, given our history together."
"An obligation,"
Evelyn repeated, the familiar bitterness returning to her voice.
"You felt an obligation to secretly provide financial support to a woman you were once engaged to marry, using money from an estate that belongs to both of us, without a single word to your own wife."
"I did not know how to tell you," Duke admitted, his voice quieter now, stripped of the defensive edge it had carried moments before. "I knew how it would appear, how it would sound. I told myself I was simply helping an old friend through difficult circumstances, nothing more." "And the letters?" Evelyn pressed, refusing to let him retreat into vague justifications. "The talk of what might have been, of wondering whether it is too late to discover what remains between you. Do those words sound like the correspondence of simple friends to you, Duke?" He fell silent, unable to offer any defense against the evidence she had presented so plainly before him. Evelyn watched him struggle, some part of her almost pitying the man before her, though the larger part remained focused on the anger and hurt that had been building steadily for weeks. "I need the truth," she said finally, "all of it. Do you still love her?" Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the letters spread across his desk rather than meeting her eyes directly. "I do not know how to answer that honestly," he admitted at last. "When I saw her again after all these years, I felt things I had believed long buried. Regret, perhaps, for how our engagement ended, for choices made by our families rather than by ourselves. I cannot say with certainty whether what I feel constitutes love, but I know it is something I have struggled to ignore." The honesty, however painful, at least offered Evelyn something concrete to work with, rather than another web of careful evasions. "And what of our marriage, Duke? What of the vows we made to each other, the years we have spent building a life together? Do those mean nothing when weighed against feelings for a woman you have not seen in 6 years until recently?" "Of course they mean something," Duke said quickly, though his voice lacked the conviction needed to make the words entirely believable. "I never intended to hurt you, Evelyn. I never set out to betray our marriage. I simply found myself caught between obligations I did not know how to navigate." Evelyn shook her head slowly, disappointment settling heavy in her chest. "You did not find yourself caught between anything, Duke. You made choices, each one deliberate, to keep secrets from me, to provide financial support without my knowledge, to entertain correspondence filled with romantic longing, while I remained here, believing our marriage still held meaning for you." She gathered the letters from the desk, tucking them back into her pocket, unwilling to leave them in his possession any longer. "I do not know what our marriage looks like moving forward, Duke. I do not know if it can survive what has been revealed these past weeks. But I know I cannot continue as we have been, pretending everything remains as it should while you maintain secret correspondence with a woman you still clearly harbor feelings for." "What are you saying?" Duke asked, alarm creeping into his voice for the first time since the conversation began. "I am saying I need time," Evelyn replied, "time to think, to understand what I truly want, separate from the expectations placed upon me as your wife. I will not make any hasty decisions tonight, but I will not continue pretending nothing has changed between us either." She left him alone in the study, his shoulders slumped in a manner she had rarely witnessed throughout their marriage, and made her way back to her own chamber, feeling both lighter and heavier than she had before the confrontation began. The truth, however painful, at least offered clarity, where confusion had reigned for weeks. Over the following days, word of the discovered letters somehow made its way beyond the walls of their household, though Evelyn suspected it was Duke himself, in a moment of guilt or panic, who had confided in someone who proved less than discreet. Whispers spread through the county with remarkable speed, each retelling adding new embellishments to the original scandal, until Evelyn found herself the subject of pitying glances and hushed conversations wherever she went. Lady Prescott arrived once more, this time bringing news that troubled Evelyn even further. "My dear," the older woman said, settling into the drawing room with an expression grave enough to signal serious concern. "I fear the situation has grown more complicated than any of us anticipated. Serafina's family debts, it seems, extend far beyond what even I had initially understood. There is talk of legal action, of creditors threatening to expose the full extent of their financial ruin unless significant sums are paid immediately." "And you believe Duke intends to provide these sums himself?" Evelyn said, already understanding where the conversation was heading. "I believe he already has, in part," Lady Prescott confirmed. "My sources suggest the withdrawal you discovered in the household ledgers was merely the beginning. There have been additional payments since, each one larger than the last, as Serafina's family situation continues to deteriorate." Evelyn absorbed this information with a growing sense of alarm, understanding now the full scope of what she was facing. Not only had Duke maintained an emotional connection to a woman from his past, he had been systematically depleting their shared finances to support her family's collapsing fortunes, all without a single word of honesty to his own wife. "This cannot continue," Evelyn said firmly, more to herself than to Lady Prescott. "Whatever obligation he feels toward Serafina, he cannot be permitted to sacrifice our family's financial stability to satisfy it." "I agree entirely," Lady Prescott said, "which is precisely why I felt it necessary to bring this to your attention directly, rather than allow you to remain unaware of the full extent of the situation. You deserve to make informed decisions about your future, Evelyn, and you cannot do so while operating with incomplete information." That evening, Evelyn requested access to the full household ledgers, spending hours poring over entries that confirmed everything Lady Prescott had suggested. The withdrawals had indeed continued, growing steadily larger over recent weeks, each one listed with the same vague designation of personal expense that had first raised her suspicions. The total sum, once calculated, left her genuinely shaken, representing a significant portion of the estate's liquid resources that had taken years of careful management to accumulate. She confronted Duke again the following morning, presenting him with the calculated totals and demanding a full accounting of where the money had gone and why he had believed himself entitled to make such decisions without consulting her. "The estate belongs to both of us," she said, her voice sharp with barely contained fury. "You cannot simply drain our resources to support another family's debts without so much as a conversation about the consequences for our own household." Duke, backed into a corner he could no longer talk his way out of, finally admitted the full truth. "Serafina's father threatened to make our association public if I did not continue providing assistance. He believed, correctly it seems, that I would rather pay whatever sum he demanded than risk further scandal touching our family name." "So you allowed yourself to be blackmailed," Evelyn said, disbelief coloring her voice. "Rather than simply telling him no, rather than accepting whatever scandal might follow from refusing his demands, you chose instead to secretly deplete our finances, risking our own family's stability to protect a reputation that has already been thoroughly damaged regardless." Duke had no response to offer, his silence confirming everything Evelyn had already concluded. She left the conversation with a clarity she had not possessed before, understanding now that whatever remained of her marriage to Duke had been built on a foundation far more fragile and compromised than she had ever imagined. She spent that afternoon with her solicitor, a careful and discreet man named Mr. Whitfield, who had managed her own family's affairs long before her marriage to Duke. She explained the situation in full, sparing no detail, and requested his guidance on what options existed for protecting her own financial interests should the marriage continue to deteriorate. Mr. Whitfield listened carefully, then outlined several possibilities, from a formal separation that would protect Evelyn's remaining assets, to more drastic measures should the situation warrant them. Evelyn absorbed the information carefully, grateful for the practical clarity it offered, amid the emotional turmoil that had consumed her over the past weeks. "You need not decide anything immediately, Lady Whitmore," Mr. Whitfield advised as their meeting concluded, "but I would strongly recommend you take steps to protect what remains of your personal inheritance, regardless of how matters proceed with your husband. Whatever affection or loyalty you may still hold for him, you must also consider your own security and future." Evelyn returned home that evening with a growing sense of resolve, understanding that whatever decision she ultimately made regarding her marriage, she would not do so without first securing her own protection and independence. The woman who had married Duke 3 years ago, trusting completely and without reservation, had learned hard lessons about the necessity of self-preservation, lessons she did not intend to forget moving forward. News of the financial troubles, like the earlier scandal of the ball itself, soon spread beyond the walls of their household, further damaging Duke's already tarnished reputation among their social circle. Invitations that had once arrived regularly began to dwindle, replaced instead by carefully worded notes expressing sympathy for Evelyn's situation, while pointedly excluding Duke from mention entirely. Evelyn found herself, somewhat to her surprise, becoming an object of quiet admiration among certain circles, particularly among the women of the county who had long suspected similar troubles within their own marriages, but lacked the courage or resources to address them directly. Margaret reported hearing several conversations praising Evelyn's composure and dignity throughout the unfolding scandal, a small comfort amid the larger difficulties she continued to navigate. Julian, too, continued his careful correspondence, never overstepping the boundaries of propriety, but always present when Evelyn needed reassurance that not every man in her life had proven capable of such profound betrayal. His letters offered steady comfort, filled with genuine concern for her well-being, rather than any attempt to press his own interests, and Evelyn found herself increasingly grateful for his consistent presence, however carefully maintained at a respectable distance. As the weeks continued to unfold, Evelyn watched her husband's world slowly crumble around him, the careful reputation he had spent years building, now tarnished beyond easy repair. Serafina, for her part, remained largely absent from public view, though rumors persisted that she continued to correspond with Duke, continued to press him for further financial assistance, despite the growing scandal their association had already caused. Evelyn understood, with increasing certainty, that the marriage she had once hoped to salvage had likely progressed beyond any point of genuine repair. The question that remained was not whether she still loved the man Duke had become, for she suspected that love, however real it had once been, had already begun to fade beneath the weight of his repeated betrayals. The question that remained was simply what she intended to do about it, and how she intended to reclaim the life and dignity she had nearly lost sight of over 3 years of quiet compromise. She did not yet have a complete answer, but she understood, finally, that she possessed the strength to find one. A month after the ball, Evelyn's brother Edmund arrived at the estate unannounced, having heard the full extent of the scandal through letters from concerned relatives, eager to keep the family informed of developments. Edmund had always been protective of his younger sister, and his expression upon entering the drawing room carried a mixture of concern and barely restrained anger that Evelyn recognized immediately from their shared childhood. "I came as soon as I heard," Edmund said, embracing her briefly, before settling into the chair across from where she sat. "Evelyn, tell me everything. I want to understand exactly what has happened, and what you intend to do about it." She recounted the full story once more, growing weary of repeating the details, but understanding her brother's need to hear them directly from her, rather than through the distorted lens of county gossip. Edmund listened with a tightening jaw, his hands clenching periodically, as she described the ball, the letters, the financial deception that had followed. "He must be held accountable for this," Edmund said, once she had finished. "I could speak with him myself, make clear the consequences he faces, should he continue this behavior." "That is kind of you, Edmund. But this is not a matter that can be resolved through threats or intimidation," Evelyn replied, though she appreciated the protective instinct behind his offer. "I must decide for myself how to proceed, based on what I believe is best for my own future." "And what do you believe that is?" Edmund asked, his tone softening slightly. Evelyn considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not yet know with certainty. Part of me still remembers the man I fell in love with 3 years ago, still hopes there might be some path toward repairing what has been broken. But a larger part of me understands that trust, once shattered so thoroughly, may never be fully restored, regardless of whatever apologies or promises Duke might offer. Edmund reached over and took her hand, his expression gentle despite the anger still simmering beneath the surface. Whatever you decide, know that our family will support you completely. You need not remain in a marriage that has caused you such pain, regardless of what society might expect or demand of you. His words offered comfort, though Evelyn understood the complexity of the decision facing her extended far beyond simple family support. There were considerations of finances, of social standing, of the practical realities that came with unwinding a marriage that had connected two prominent families for 3 years. She thanked her brother for his visit and his reassurance, promising to keep him informed as the situation continued to develop, before he departed the following morning, leaving her once again alone with her thoughts. That same week, Duke made his first genuine attempt at reconciliation, approaching Evelyn one evening with an earnestness she had not witnessed from him in longer than she could remember. He found her in the eastern garden, tending to the roses that had always brought her comfort during difficult times, and approached slowly, as though uncertain of his welcome. "Evelyn, might I speak with you?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the defensive edge that had characterized their previous conversations. She set down her gardening shears and turned to face him, studying his expression carefully for any sign of the careful evasions he had so often relied upon in the past. What she found instead was something closer to genuine vulnerability, an openness she had not seen from him since the earliest days of their courtship. "I am listening," she said, though her tone remained guarded. "I have ended all contact with Serafina," Duke said, the words coming out in a rush, as though he had been rehearsing them for some time and feared losing his nerve before finishing. "I have informed her father that no further financial assistance will be forthcoming, regardless of whatever threats he continues to make. I understand fully now the damage I have caused, and I wish, more than anything, to find a way to earn back your trust." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, wanting desperately to believe the sincerity behind his words, while remaining wary of falling back into the same pattern of accepting promises that had proven hollow before. "Why now, Duke? What has changed since our last conversation on this matter?" "I have had time to think, truly think, about what I stand to lose," he said. "I have watched our marriage crumble these past weeks, watched you grow more distant with each passing day, and I have finally understood that whatever confused feelings I once harbored for Serafina pale entirely in comparison to what I risk losing with you. I was a fool to ever let old memories cloud my judgment so completely." "Words come easily, Duke," Evelyn said, though her voice had softened slightly despite herself. "Actions have always proven far more difficult for you to maintain consistently. I understand your skepticism, and I do not expect you to simply accept my word without proof," Duke replied. "I only ask for the opportunity to demonstrate, through my actions over time, that I am truly committed to repairing what I have broken between us." Evelyn remained quiet for a long moment, weighing his words against everything she had learned over the past weeks, against the pattern of behavior that had defined their marriage, long before Serafina's return had brought matters to a crisis point. She thought of the coldness that had settled between them long before the ball, the distance that had grown steadily, even without the added complication of his former fiancé's reappearance. "I appreciate you telling me this, Duke," she said finally, "but I cannot simply return to how things were before, pretending that trust can be restored through words alone. If you truly wish to repair our marriage, it will require considerable time, and considerable proof that your commitment extends beyond a single evening's conversation in the garden." Duke nodded, accepting her words with a humility that surprised her. "I understand. I am prepared to earn that trust back, however long it takes." Over the following weeks, Duke did indeed seem to make genuine efforts toward change. He remained at home more consistently, involving himself in estate matters he had long neglected, spending evenings with Evelyn rather than retreating to his study or claiming urgent business elsewhere. He answered her questions honestly when she raised concerns, no longer offering the vague evasions that had once characterized their conversations. But even as these changes unfolded, Evelyn found herself unable to fully release the guardedness that had settled within her since the discovery of the letters. Where once she might have accepted such efforts as sufficient proof of his commitment, she now found herself watching carefully for any sign of backsliding, any indication that his newfound devotion might prove as temporary as the coldness that had preceded it. It was during this period of cautious reconciliation that new information reached her, this time through Margaret, who arrived one afternoon with news that complicated the situation further. "Evelyn, I do not know quite how to tell you this," Margaret began, settling into the familiar chair in Evelyn's sitting room, with an expression of genuine concern. "I have learned, through a rather reliable source, that Serafina has already moved on to cultivate a connection with another gentleman, a wealthy widower recently arrived from the north." Evelyn absorbed this information slowly, uncertain at first how it should affect her own feelings toward the situation. So she has found a new source of financial support, now that Duke has cut off his assistance. "It would appear so," Margaret confirmed. "My source suggests she has already secured a considerable sum from this new gentleman, using much the same approach she employed with Duke, appealing to old sympathies and manufactured affection to extract financial assistance for her family's continuing debts." The revelation, rather than bringing Evelyn comfort, instead left her with a complicated mixture of emotions. Part of her felt a bitter satisfaction in learning that Serafina's interest in Duke had likely been motivated as much by financial necessity as by any genuine romantic feeling, confirming Lady Prescott's earlier suspicions about the woman's pattern of behavior. But another part of her recognized the deeper implications of this news, that Duke's willingness to risk his marriage and deplete their finances had been, at least in part, in service of a woman who viewed him as little more than a convenient source of income. "Does Duke know of this development?" Evelyn asked. "I do not believe so, though I suspect it is only a matter of time before word reaches him as well," Margaret replied. "The county has grown rather fond of tracking Lady Vale's activities, given the scandal her return has already caused." Evelyn considered whether to share this information with Duke, uncertain whether it would serve any useful purpose beyond potentially wounding his pride further, or whether it might genuinely help him understand the true nature of the woman he had risked so much to protect. She ultimately decided to tell him, reasoning that complete honesty between them remained essential if any genuine reconciliation was to be possible. She found him that evening in his study, and relayed the information Margaret had shared, watching his expression carefully as understanding slowly dawned. Duke sat in silence for a long moment after she finished speaking, processing the implications of what he had just learned. "I suppose I should not be surprised," he said finally, his voice carrying a bitter edge that Evelyn had not heard from him before. "I allowed myself to believe her affection was genuine, that our shared history meant something beyond simple convenience. It seems I was a fool twice over, first in risking my marriage for her sake, and second in believing her feelings for me carried any true weight beyond financial necessity." "I am sorry, Duke," Evelyn said, and found that she genuinely meant it, despite everything he had put her through over the past months. Whatever anger and hurt she still carried, she took no pleasure in watching him confront this particular humiliation. "Do not apologize," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You warned me, in your own way, that I was allowing old feelings to cloud my judgment. I simply refused to listen until the consequences became impossible to ignore." The revelation seemed to solidify something within Duke, a final release of whatever lingering attachment he had maintained toward Serafina, despite his earlier promises to end their association. In the weeks that followed, his efforts toward reconciliation with Evelyn intensified, his commitment to rebuilding their marriage seeming more genuine now that the illusion of Serafina's affection had been thoroughly shattered. But even as Duke's behavior continued to improve, Evelyn found herself increasingly uncertain about what she truly wanted from her marriage moving forward. The trust that had once existed between them, the easy comfort of a partnership built on mutual respect and affection, had been so thoroughly damaged that she wondered whether it could ever be fully restored, regardless of how genuinely Duke now seemed committed to change. She continued her correspondence with Julian throughout this period, his letters remaining a steady source of comfort and clarity amid the confusion of her marriage. He never pressed her for more than she was willing to give, never suggested that her difficulties with Duke should push her toward any particular decision regarding their own relationship. But his consistent presence, his steady kindness, offered a stark contrast to the turbulent uncertainty that continued to define her marriage, and Evelyn found herself increasingly aware of how different her life might look should she choose a path that did not include Duke at all. One evening, as autumn began to settle over the county, and the roses in her garden started their slow fade toward winter dormancy, Evelyn found herself sitting alone with a cup of tea, finally allowing herself to fully consider the question she had been avoiding for weeks. Did she wish to remain married to Duke, to continue the slow, uncertain process of rebuilding trust that had been so thoroughly shattered? Or did she wish to reclaim her independence entirely, to step away from a marriage that had brought her more pain than joy over its 3-year duration, regardless of whatever genuine change Duke now seemed committed to demonstrating? She did not yet have a complete answer to either question, but she understood, with growing clarity, that the decision belonged entirely to her, unburdened by considerations of what society expected, or what her family might prefer. Whatever path she chose, it would be one she selected freely, with full understanding of both its costs and its rewards. The time for that decision, she suspected, was rapidly approaching. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a cold clarity that Evelyn found strangely fitting for the decisions she knew she could no longer postpone. Duke continued his efforts at reconciliation, attentive and consistent in ways that might once have satisfied her completely, had they arrived before the events of the ball and everything that followed. But Evelyn found herself measuring his current behavior not against some ideal of what a good husband should be, but against the accumulated weight of everything she had learned about his character over the preceding months. She invited Julian to visit one afternoon, a gesture she knew carried risk given the ongoing scandal surrounding her marriage, but one she felt necessary regardless of how it might appear to others. She received him in the small sitting room overlooking the gardens, now stripped bare by the season's first frost, and found herself grateful for his presence, in a way that went beyond simple friendship. "I have been thinking a great deal about my future," she told him, once they had settled with tea, and the initial pleasantries had passed. "And I find I no longer know how to separate my own genuine feelings from the expectations placed upon me by my marriage, my family, and society at large." Julian listened with the patient attentiveness that had characterized all their interactions since the night of the ball. "May I ask what troubles you most in reaching this decision?" Evelyn considered the question carefully before answering. "I fear that whatever choice I make, I will be accused of acting rashly, of allowing my hurt feelings to override practical considerations that should carry more weight. My family would prefer I remain married, for the sake of stability and reputation. Duke insists he has changed, and perhaps he has, at least for now. But I cannot shake the feeling that I am being asked to forgive, not because forgiveness is deserved, but because it would be more convenient for everyone involved." "You need not seek convenience," Julian said quietly. "You need only seek what will allow you to live authentically, with dignity and self-respect intact, whatever that path looks like, whether it includes remaining married to Duke or choosing a different future entirely. The decision belongs to you alone." "And what of you, Julian?" Evelyn asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. "What do you hope for in all of this?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered his response. "I will not pretend that my feelings toward you have remained entirely uncomplicated these past months, Evelyn. I have cared for you since long before your marriage to Duke, and watching you endure such pain has been difficult for me, in ways I have tried not to burden you with. But I would never wish for you to make a decision about your marriage based on any hope you might harbor regarding a future between us. That would be unfair to you, and would taint whatever choice you ultimately make with considerations that should have no place in it." His honesty touched her deeply, and she found herself grateful for a man who could express such genuine feeling, while still respecting the boundaries of what remained appropriate given her current circumstances. "Thank you for that, Julian. I confess I have wondered about my own feelings toward you as well, though I have tried to keep such thoughts separate from the more pressing matter of what to do about my marriage." "That seems wise," Julian said with a small smile. "Whatever happens between us, if anything does, should happen only once you have made your decision about Duke freely, without any outside influence clouding your judgment." Their conversation continued for another hour, touching on lighter subjects, allowing Evelyn a brief respite from the heavy considerations that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. When Julian finally took his leave, she felt steadier than she had in some time, grateful for his continued presence in her life, even as she understood the necessity of keeping her decision about Duke entirely separate from whatever possibilities might exist with Julian in the future. That evening, Duke approached her once more, this time with a proposal that surprised her with its specificity. "I have been thinking," he said, finding her in the library where she had retreated to read. Perhaps we might benefit from spending time away from the estate, away from the whispers and scrutiny of the county. A journey to the coast, perhaps, where we might rediscover what first drew us together, without the constant reminder of recent troubles surrounding us at every turn. Evelyn considered the offer, understanding the genuine effort behind it, though she found herself unable to fully embrace the optimism Duke seemed to be expressing. A journey would not erase what has happened between us, Duke. It would simply provide temporary distance from the consequences. I understand that, he said. I do not expect a simple trip to solve everything that has gone wrong. I only hope it might offer us space to reconnect, away from distractions, so that we might better understand whether our marriage still holds the foundation necessary for genuine repair. Evelyn agreed, cautiously, understanding that refusing entirely might close off possibilities she was not yet ready to fully abandon. They departed for the coast 3 days later, taking rooms at a quiet inn overlooking the water, far removed from the social circles that had witnessed their marriage's public unraveling. The days that followed brought moments of genuine connection, conversations that reminded Evelyn of the early days of their courtship, walks along the shore where Duke seemed more present and attentive than he had been in years. She allowed herself, cautiously, to consider the possibility that their marriage might yet be salvageable, that the man walking beside her now might genuinely represent a return to the partner she had once believed him to be. But on their 4th evening at the coast, a letter arrived for Duke, forwarded from the estate, and Evelyn watched his expression shift the moment he recognized the handwriting on the envelope. He excused himself quickly, retreating to read the letter in privacy, and though he claimed later that it concerned nothing more than routine estate business, Evelyn noticed the way his hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter away, the way his attention remained distracted for the remainder of the evening despite his efforts to appear otherwise. She did not confront him immediately, choosing instead to observe, understanding now the patterns that had defined so much of their marriage's recent troubles. But the following morning, while Duke had gone for an early walk along the shore, she found the letter tucked into his coat pocket, and though she knew reading it without his knowledge crossed boundaries she had promised herself to respect, her hand moved almost involuntarily to retrieve it. The letter was from Serafina, brief but unmistakable in its intent, expressing regret over their falling out and suggesting that perhaps, once matters had settled sufficiently, they might resume their friendship on different terms than before. It contained no explicit request for money, no overt declaration of continued romantic feeling, but the careful phrasing left little doubt about its true purpose. A door deliberately left open should Duke's marriage prove as unsalvageable as recent months had suggested. Evelyn stood alone in their rented room, the letter trembling slightly in her hands, and felt something within her finally settle into complete, unshakable clarity. Whatever genuine effort Duke had made these recent weeks, whatever sincerity had colored his words during their journey to the coast, the persistent presence of Serafina in his life, however peripheral, told her everything she needed to know about the true state of his commitment to their marriage. She returned the letter to exactly where she had found it, then sat by the window overlooking the water, watching the waves roll steadily toward shore, and allowed herself finally to acknowledge the decision that had been building within her for weeks, perhaps for months, since long before she had even discovered the full truth about Serafina's return. She no longer wished to remain married to Duke. The realization brought with it not despair, but a strange and unexpected relief, as though she had finally set down a burden she had been carrying far too long without acknowledging its weight. She thought of the years ahead, of the life she might build free from the constant uncertainty and disappointment that had characterized her marriage's final months. She thought of her own family's support, of Margaret's steady friendship, of Julian's patient presence, though she reminded herself once more that her decision needed to stand independent of any hopes regarding a future with him. When Duke returned from his walk, finding her still seated by the window, he immediately sensed the shift in her demeanor, though he could not have known its precise cause. "Evelyn, is something troubling you?" She turned to face him, her expression calm, despite the significance of what she was about to say. "I believe it is time we returned home, Duke. I have made a decision about our marriage, and I would prefer to discuss it properly, away from this borrowed room, and its temporary illusions of a fresh start." Duke's face paled slightly, understanding perhaps more than she had explicitly stated. "Evelyn, please, whatever you are thinking, I ask that you consider it carefully before acting." "I have considered it carefully, Duke," she replied, her voice steady and sure, in a way it had not been for months. more carefully than perhaps anything else in my life. I believe our marriage has run its course, and I believe continuing to force its survival would only prolong pain for both of us, rather than offering any genuine path toward happiness. They returned to the estate the following day, the journey passing in a silence heavier than any that had preceded it, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. Evelyn felt no satisfaction in the decision she had reached, only a quiet, steady certainty that this path, however difficult it might prove, represented the only honest option remaining to her. That evening, once they had settled back into the familiar routines of the estate, Evelyn requested a formal conversation with Duke, one that would finally address the future of their marriage, with the clarity and directness that had been so often missing from their earlier exchanges. She found him waiting in the drawing room, his expression a mixture of resignation and lingering hope that perhaps she might yet change her mind. But as she settled into the chair across from him, prepared finally to speak the words she had been carrying since that quiet morning by the coastal window, she understood with complete certainty that whatever hope Duke still harbored would not be enough to alter the decision she had already made. The time for uncertainty had passed. The time for honest reckoning had finally arrived. "I have decided to end our marriage," Evelyn said, her voice steady, despite the weight of the words she had waited so long to speak aloud. "I do not say this to punish you, Duke, nor out of anger alone, though I confess, anger has certainly played its part in bringing me to this decision. I say it because I have come to understand, with complete clarity, that I can no longer build my future around the hope that you might someday fully release your attachment to a past that continues to intrude upon our present." Duke sat motionless for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, then something closer to grief, before finally settling into a kind of weary acceptance that told Evelyn he had perhaps expected this outcome all along, despite his efforts to convince himself otherwise. "The letter," he said quietly. "You found the letter from Serafina, did you not?" "I did," Evelyn confirmed, seeing no reason to deny it now that her decision had already been made. "And while I understand you may not have invited her renewed correspondence, the mere fact that she still feels comfortable writing to you, still feels there remains some door left open between you, tells me everything I need to know about the true state of things, regardless of your intentions." "I did not respond to her," Duke said, though his voice carried little conviction that this defense would prove sufficient. "I have not seen her since our return from the coast, nor do I intend to." "I believe you," Evelyn said, and found that she genuinely did. "But intentions matter little at this point, Duke. I have spent these past months watching our marriage unravel thread by thread, each revelation more painful than the last. I do not believe I can rebuild the trust necessary to sustain a genuine partnership between us, regardless of how sincerely you might now wish to change." Duke was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded in his lap, before finally looking up to meet her eyes directly. "What will you require, moving forward? I will not fight you on whatever terms you believe fair, Evelyn. I owe you that much, at the very least, after everything I have put you through." His acceptance, however painful, offered Evelyn a measure of relief she had not fully anticipated. She had prepared herself for arguments, for pleading, perhaps even for anger, but instead found a man finally willing to acknowledge the full consequences of his choices without further deflection or excuse. Over the following weeks, with Mr. Whitfield's careful guidance, Evelyn and Duke worked through the practical details of their separation, a process complicated by the social expectations of their standing, but made somewhat easier by Duke's genuine cooperation throughout. He agreed to terms that protected Evelyn's financial independence, ensuring she would retain both her original inheritance and a fair portion of the estate's remaining resources, sufficient to allow her to establish a household of her own, separate entirely from the life they had built together. News of the formal separation spread through the county with the same speed that had characterized every previous chapter of their scandal, though Evelyn found herself surprised by the largely sympathetic response from those around her. Where once she had feared judgment and pity, she instead encountered quiet admiration from many quarters, particularly among women, who recognized in her decision a courage they themselves had never quite found the strength to exercise in their own difficult marriages. Lady Prescott visited once more shortly after the separation became public knowledge, her expression carrying an approval that Evelyn had not expected from a woman so devoted to family loyalty. "You have done what few women in your position would find the courage to do, my dear," she said, I know this path will not be easy, but I believe, in time, you will find it was the right choice, both for yourself and for your future happiness. Margaret, too, offered unwavering support throughout the transition, helping Evelyn locate a suitable townhouse in a neighboring county, far enough removed from the estate to offer genuine distance, but close enough that she need not sacrifice the friendships and family connections that had sustained her through the difficult months. The two women spent countless hours arranging furniture, selecting fabrics, and slowly transforming the new residence into a home that reflected Evelyn's own tastes and preferences, unburdened for the first time in years by the need to accommodate someone else's expectations. As for Duke, the consequences of his choices continued to unfold in ways that offered Evelyn no particular satisfaction, though she could not deny a certain sense of justice in watching the full weight of his decisions finally settle upon him. Serafina, as Margaret had predicted, had indeed moved on entirely to cultivate her connection with the wealthy widower from the north, and word soon reached the county that the two had married in a quiet ceremony, far removed from the scandal that had defined Serafina's return to English society. Duke, left without either his marriage or the woman he had risked so much to maintain a connection with, found himself increasingly isolated in the months that followed. His business associates, wary of the scandal that continued to cling to his name, grew more distant in their dealings with him. Invitations to social gatherings, once plentiful given his standing and title, dwindled to almost nothing, as the county's collective sympathy remained firmly with Evelyn throughout the separation process. Evelyn heard occasional reports of his circumstances through mutual acquaintances, learning that he had grown increasingly withdrawn, spending most of his time alone at the estate, the grand halls that had once hosted lavish gatherings, now echoing with a silence that seemed to match the isolation he had ultimately created for himself through his own choices. She felt no particular satisfaction in these reports, though she could not deny a certain vindication in understanding that the consequences of betrayal, however delayed, had finally arrived regardless. 6 months after the formal separation was finalized, Evelyn found herself settled comfortably into her new townhouse, surrounded by friends who had remained loyal throughout the difficult transition, and beginning to rediscover parts of herself that had been slowly buried beneath years of quiet compromise within her marriage. She resumed activities she had long neglected, returning to her passion for painting, which she had set aside years earlier, when Duke had suggested it distracted from her other duties as his wife. She began hosting small gatherings of her own, filled with laughter and genuine connection, rather than the careful social calculations that had defined so many evenings at the estate. Julian remained a steady presence throughout this period of transition, though he continued to respect the boundaries Evelyn had established, never pressing for more than friendship while she navigated the significant changes reshaping her life. It was only after the separation had been fully finalized, after Evelyn had settled comfortably into her new independence and found genuine peace with the decisions she had made, that their relationship began to shift naturally into something deeper. He called upon her one autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the fateful ball that had set everything in motion, finding her in the small garden behind her townhouse, tending to roses she had planted herself shortly after moving in. She looked up as he approached, offering a genuine smile that carried none of the guardedness that had characterized their interactions during the darkest months of her marriage's unraveling. "Lord Ashcombe," she said, setting down her gardening tools, "what brings you to visit on such a pleasant afternoon?" "I confess I have been meaning to visit for some time," Julian admitted, "though I did not wish to intrude upon your independence before you felt ready to welcome such visits. I hope I have not misjudged the timing." "You have not," Evelyn assured him, gesturing toward the small bench nestled among her roses. "Please, sit with me a while. I find I have missed our conversations these past months, even as I understood the necessity of the distance we maintained." They talked for hours that afternoon, the conversation flowing easily between them in a way that felt entirely different from the careful, measured exchanges of the previous year. Evelyn found herself laughing freely, sharing stories of her new life with a genuine enthusiasm she had not felt in longer than she cared to remember, while Julian listened with the same patient attentiveness that had first drawn her to trust him during the darkest days following the ball. As autumn deepened into winter, their visits grew more frequent, each one bringing them closer together, though both proceeded with a careful deliberateness that reflected lessons learned through Evelyn's difficult first marriage. She had no intention of rushing into another commitment without first ensuring the foundation was built on genuine trust and mutual respect. qualities she now understood, far more clearly than she had before her marriage to Duke. By the following spring, when Julian finally asked whether she might consider a future together, formalized through marriage rather than simply careful friendship, Evelyn found herself ready to answer with a confidence and clarity that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, through the difficult months following the ball's devastating revelations, and she understood now, with complete certainty, exactly what she wanted from her future, and exactly what kind of partnership would allow her to remain true to the woman she had worked so hard to reclaim. Yes, she told him, standing once more in the garden that had become her sanctuary throughout the transformation of the past year. I would be honored to build a future with you, Julian. Though I ask that we proceed with patience, ensuring we build something lasting, rather than rushing toward promises we are not yet fully prepared to keep. I would want nothing less, Julian replied, taking her hand gently in his. We have both learned, I think, the value of honesty and patience in matters of the heart. I intend to honor those lessons fully as we move forward together. As for Duke, word eventually reached Evelyn that he had left the county entirely, selling much of his remaining property to settle debts that had continued to accumulate in the aftermath of his failed attempts to salvage both his marriage and his connection to Serafina. He relocated to a distant estate, inherited from a distant relative, far removed from the social circles that had once celebrated his standing and title, choosing instead a quieter, more isolated existence that reflected the consequences of choices made in a single, fateful evening at a ball that had changed everything. Evelyn felt no particular need to seek out further news of his circumstances, understanding that her own path forward required leaving the past fully behind, rather than continuing to measure her happiness against whatever fate had befallen the man who had once been her husband. She had built something new, something entirely her own, forged through difficulty and heartbreak into a strength she had not known she possessed before that terrible night, when Duke had walked into the ballroom with another woman on his arm. The scandal that had once consumed the county's collective attention gradually faded into memory, replaced by newer gossip, newer dramas that captured society's fickle interest. But for Evelyn, the lessons learned throughout that difficult year remained permanently woven into the fabric of who she had become. A woman who understood the true cost of accepting less than she deserved, and the profound freedom that came from finally choosing herself, regardless of what others might expect or demand. She married Julian the following autumn, in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by the friends and family who had supported her throughout her darkest months, a stark contrast to the grand, elaborate wedding that had marked her first marriage's beginning. This time, she walked into her future with clear eyes and genuine confidence, understanding fully what she wanted and what she deserved from a partnership built on honesty rather than careful appearances. The ball that had once threatened to destroy everything she believed about her life had instead become the catalyst for a transformation she had never anticipated, a painful but ultimately necessary awakening that had led her, step by difficult step, toward a happiness she had nearly forgotten was possible. Evelyn had lost a marriage, but in doing so, she had found herself, and in finding herself, she had discovered a future far brighter than anything she had imagined possible on that fateful night when everything fell apart.